Welcome to another session of the PMDG MD11 training from Angle of Attack. Welcome to the difficult approach. The term difficult approach is not particularly descriptive. None of the approaches we have flown so far have been exactly easy, but this one is something else. So get ready for some of the toughest hand flying you can expect from the MD11. So we will be flying the IGS runway 13 approach into Kai Tak Airport, Hong Kong's former international airport. The airport had a controversial safety record and closed in July 1998 after 73 years of service. We've already flown out of its successor, Cheplapkak, but now we pay our respects and relive the glory days of this aviation icon. For this approach, we'll be using the Fly Kai Tak scenery from Fly Tampa, and the chart comes from the documentation that they include within this product. We will join the approach about 10 miles east of the Charlie Hotel VOR with the airbag checklist complete and only the navigation radios left to tune. When we jump in, the autopilot will be engaged, speed will be 210 knots, holding altitude at 8,000 feet, and VOR mode tracking the 270 bearing to Charlie Hotel. Before we get too carried away with flying though, let's do a comprehensive run through of the chart. As said before, we will start by tracking the 270 bearing to the Charlie Hotel VOR. Once overhead the station, we will disconnect autopilot, auto throttle, and turn off the flight director. Yes, you heard right. We're doing this one purely on raw data without any of that fancy automation that we have come to know and love. If you haven't already, I'd strongly suggest reviewing the visual approach section before you try this approach because it's going to be very difficult. With the automatics turned off, we'll slow down to 180 knots and initiate a gentle descent, tracking the 270 radial and aiming for 6,000 feet at waypoint Golf, which is 7 DME. We then have two options. If above 180 knots, we will turn track 045 to intercept the IGS localizer. If 180 knots or below, we will turn to overfly the Sierra Lima NDB. And we haven't covered NDB navigation at all so far in the training, so we'll take this route so it will be a great opportunity to demonstrate exactly what it is. After passing the Sierra Lima NDB, we will turn to intercept the IGS localizer, course 088. We will also track the glide slope when we capture it. Now, the IGS behaves just like an ILS. It has a localizer and a glide slope component, which are indicated to us in exactly the same way as they would be for an ILS approach. The principal difference, which you must be absolutely ready for, is that at about 500 feet, we will need to make a tight, low-level turn to final for runway 13, and this is the famous turn that you have seen on the many YouTube videos out there. Note the difference in the courses here, 088 for the IGS and 130 for the runway. That's quite a turn and will be very tough, believe me. Now, the 8 is reported a 21 knot crosswind from 190. This gives us an 18 knot crosswind component from the right. When judging our turn, we will need to compensate for this or we will be blown off centerline, and this will pose to be a very challenging feat. So next, we'll go through the facts, followed by the final approach brief, which is very important. Frequencies. Charlie Hotel VOR frequency is 112.3. We already have this set in the navigation radios page as we are already tracking it. The Sierra Lima NDB frequency is 268 kilohertz. The IGS frequency is 111.9. We will need the Tango Hotel VOR frequency for the missed approach, 115.5. So quite a few frequencies. Altitudes. We will pass overhead the Charlie Hotel VOR at 8,000 and thence aim to pass waypoint Golf at 6,000 feet. We will aim to have intercepted the IGS glide slope by 4,500 feet. Transition altitude is 11,000 feet in this area, which we are now well below. We have already set the altimeters to QNH 1101 hectopascal, so there is no published decision height for this approach. The missed approach is mandatory if by the middle marker visual flight has not been achieved because of that big turn at the end. Course. We'll be tracking the 270 degree radial to and from the Charlie Hotel VOR, and the IGS course is 088. The runway is oriented 130 degrees, so the missed approach is a climb on the IGS localizer, followed by a turn onto the Tango Hotel VOR's 315 degree radial. This translates to a 135 degree bearing to the VOR. Terrain. The reason for the IGS approach to Kai Tak is the high terrain surrounding the airport to the north. In fact, looking at the chart from an overall perspective, the entire approach is wrapped around some pretty substantial terrain. There is no published minimum safe altitude on this chart, but let's nonetheless assess the dangers. Our turn through the Sierra Lima NDB maneuvers us around Lantau Island, and this is the highest terrain, of which it is 4,100 feet. The airport itself is surrounded north and south by terrain rising to and in excess of 3,000 feet. Sticking to the instrument procedures guarantees us terrain clearance, but being intimately aware of the surrounding terrain is also vital to safety. This is particularly important during a go-around, and we will cover a go-around during the brief. Safety. This is clearly an exceptional approach in almost every regard. The turn onto final has no equal anywhere else in the world for such a large aircraft. The MD11 complicates matters further as it has a higher approach speed than most other aircraft such as the 747. A 747 might expect to fly the approach at 135 knots or maybe a little above that, so whereas we will be flying this at about 150. This will translate to a tighter turn, and the crosswind will serve only to increase this risk much further. This, coupled with the lack of flight director and auto throttle, will make this without a doubt the hardest approach in this training, and probably the hardest you'll fly in the MD11 in Flight Simulator, so I hope you are up to the challenge. We've pulled out all the stops on this approach, so buckle up. Following the format of the other approaches we have done, let's finish up the captain's approach brief. Hong Kong International, Instrument Guidance System, runway 13 approach. Charlie Hotel VOR is 112.3. Sierra Lima NDB is 268. IGS is 111.9. Approach will start overhead the Charlie Hotel VOR. When flying outbound on the 270 radial to 7 DME, turning at waypoint Golf to overfly the Sierra Lima NDB, thence intercepting the IGS. Altitude will be 8,000 at Charlie Hotel, descending to 6,000 at waypoint Golf, then intercepting the IGS by 4,500 feet. There is no decision height for the minimum descent altitude for this approach, as we must be visual. Aerodrome elevation is 15 feet. Transition altitude 11,000 feet. The highest MSA is on Lantau Island, 4,100 feet. Highest MSA shown on the chart is to the north of the airport, and that is at 3,500 feet. Missed approach is mandatory by the middle marker if visual flight has not been achieved by this point. The missed approach procedure is a climb on the IGS localizer and a turn at middle marker to intercept the 315 radial or 135 bearing to the Tango Hotel VOR, climbing to 4,500 feet all the while. A holding pattern should then be established if needed by air traffic control, and weather is visibility 10 miles, broken clouds at 5,000 feet, and wind 190 at 21 knots as we said before. Briefing complete. So lastly, before we jump in, let's note down the ATIS. Hong Kong, airport information. Hong Kong International, airport information Juliet. 0600 Zulu, wind 190 at 2-1, visibility greater than 20 miles, ceiling 6,000 broken, temperature 23, dew point 15, altimeter 1011, no significant change, landing runway 13. So here we are now aboard the aircraft, about 19 miles to run until Charlie Hotel, holding 210 knots, VOR 1 mode, and altitude at 8,000 feet. The rest of the flight plan in its entirety, including the missed approach, can be seen on the navigation display. VOR 1 is tuned and set to the Charlie Hotel VOR and is showing about 18.3 DME and a 270 degree bearing. This concurs with the radial we have set, so all is well. Now, as we discussed extensively before, there is a hefty wind today from the south. Looking at the top left of the ND, we see the wind indication 185 degrees at 21 knots. The arrow helps us visualize it. Given the direction and strength, the aircraft will have a heading slightly left of the actual ground track to compensate for this. We can see this if we look at the heading display at the top of the ND. It is showing 265 degrees, whereas our actual track should be 270. This green diamond, called the drift angle pointer, shows our current track 270 degrees as it should be. It is possible to set the ND to show the current track at the top as opposed to heading. To do this, press the heading track changeover button on the FCP. This causes the indication to switch to track in the heading track window and the ND to indicate current track. This enables us to select a track for the aircraft to maintain on the FCP, or, as we now will take advantage of, makes it easier for us to hand fly a constant track without the complication of having to compensate for wind. So everything here on the ND will just make it much simpler for us. So let's set up the McDo navigation radio page. VOR 1 should already be set to the 270 degree radial of the Charlie Hotel VOR, but we have yet to tune the Sierra Lima NDB in the IGS. So enter 268, the frequency for Sierra Lima, and enter that in ADF number 2. We'll set it as ADF number 2 as we want to have both the ADF and VOR information showing on the ND at the same time. The frequency for the IGS is 111.9 and the course is 088, so enter this information in the ILS course line. As I said earlier, at the end of the day, the IGS is just another ILS to the aircraft and all the indications are exactly the same. Lastly, we want to tune the Tango Hotel VOR, which we will need to use if we have to do a missed approach. So enter 115.5 and 135 as the course and enter it in VOR 2. All is set now on the radio's front. We are closing in rapidly on Charlie Hotel, which is the point at which we will start flying manually. With a raw data approach looming, we need to be thinking about anything we can do to make things easier later on. Obviously, we cannot complete the before landing checklist in its entirety now, but we can do the physical items on the list. So arm the spoilers and set the speed brakes to medium. This leaves only a visual scan to complete the checklist, which will take less time off flying the actual approach. So we can also set the FCP altitude to 0, as we will be hand flying and do not need the constraints there. The disadvantage to this is that we will not have the bug on the altitude tape pointing at our target, but it will prevent the aural altitude alerts, which takes away a distraction. So all we have to do now are a few more navigation radio switches. So press ADF2 on the ECP to bring up the ADF2 pointer on the ND. We'll be referencing this later when we track overhead the Sierra Lima NDB. So we are just approaching the Charlie Hotel VOR and we'll disconnect the autopilot soon, along with flight director and auto throttle to fly the approach manually. So let's get slowed down now to 180 knots. Also set the navigation display to VOR mode. We will not be returning to map mode for the rest of the approach, so before reaching the VOR, disconnect the autopilot.
Autopilot
Now as the aircraft decelerates, we need to increase our angle of attack to maintain altitude, so pitch up as needed to maintain 8,000 feet. The flight director certainly helps here. Focus both on holding your altitude and also maintaining a track of 270 to fly overhead the VOR. The beauty of track mode is that we can pinpoint precisely as it removes the complication of wind. The CDI is getting shaky, so we're right ahead. There we are, right overhead. Turn off the flight director using the off button on the auxiliary panel and disable auto thrust 2. Well, how about that? CDI and RMI only on the ND and a blank FMA and no FD on the PFD. How many abbreviations can you fit in a sentence? So smoothly bring back power and settle into a descent. We're aiming for not below 6,000 feet at waypoint golf up ahead, 7 DME. The key to a smooth descent is to find a power setting that gives you an acceptable descent rate and pitch to maintain your desired airspeed. In our case, it looks as though about 60% N1 will be good for a 1,000 foot per minute descent at 180 knots. So our speed limit for the turn up ahead is 180 knots for the path we want to take, so it will be important not to exceed that speed. Don't forget that we want to be tracking the 270 degree radial outbound. The CDI is a little off to the left, so we'll make the most subtle of turns to the left to intercept it. We are still fairly close to the VOR, so it takes a very little adjustment to make a big difference on the CDI. So you have to be very precise with your flying for this kind of thing. Using the yoke really helps, and every little input counts, and if you are too aggressive, things can get out of hand pretty quickly. So to avoid too high a nose-up pitch in that turn coming up, set flaps 28. This will add a fair amount of lift and thus a lot of drag too. You will need to add power and pitch over to maintain the same airspeed and rate of descent. Keep your eye on that DME, edging ever closer to 7. At 7 DME, we will need to start our turn. It looks like we'll be a few hundred feet above our target, but that's not a problem. The main point is that we do not want to descend below our profile altitude. Here comes 7. Remember that the green pointer on the ND is pointing at the Sierra Lima NDB. We want to fly to that station, so turn the aircraft until the green pointer is aligned with our track at the top. Switch the ND to approach mode so that the course selected pointer switches to the IGS course 088. The CDI is deflected full left, which is correct given that we are to the right of the localizer. Disregard glide slope indications at this time as we are actually in effect flying away from the airport. If we were to chase it, we would actually end up climbing. Obviously we don't want to do that, so keep the descent steady and the speed on target. If you look out the window to the right, you'll see the new Hong Kong airport, Chek Lap Kok, just peeking through. This approach takes us right over it, and it's quite a contrast to Kai Tak, which it finally replaced in 1998, and I hope you've learned plenty since we were last here earlier in the training. As our track approaches the green needle, be ready to roll out on the turn to align it at the top. You will need to start leveling the wings before you actually reach it, and it looks like we roll out just a little late here, but we are getting so close to the station that it's not an issue. Note that the needle is turning fairly quickly now away from us, and this is an indication that the NDB itself is getting very close. It's also our only indication as we don't have DME on this NDB. So don't chase it, as it will start to run away from you faster than you can actually turn to chase it. It's starting to move quicker now, and a quick swing of the needle like this shows that we have done a good job. Now, as we level the wings there after the turn, we also stop descending to wait for the glide slope. The deviation needle on the PFD is centered, so we'll begin our descent to track the glide slope. The next thing we need to look out for is the localizer, so keep your eye on the course deviation indicator on the navigation display, and when it starts moving, start your turn without delay to intercept it. While in the turn, keep speed at 180 and remain on glide slope. There is a lot of multitasking going on at this moment. It takes a lot of effort to keep all this coordinated, so start rolling out of the turn before the CDI centers and keep your track steady at a small intercept angle to allow it to center fully. This will help prevent you from overshooting the localizer. So our speed is a little low here, so we're just increasing thrust to get back to 180 knots. As we tried to hammer home in the visual approach, small and smooth thrust changes are what is needed. You have a lot of power in those 3 engines, especially at a low weight, and it's easy to power right past your target airspeed. We're making that final turn now to get established. This is one situation where track mode really comes into its own. All we need to do is center the CDI and line up the magenta course select pointer with the top of the compass rose, and we're set. We overshoot just a little here, so we're making a very subtle turn back to the left to compensate. Now, don't go overboard with your corrections. It's very easy to end up turning back and forth either side of the localizer. If you find yourself a little off, just turn gently back toward it a couple of degrees and wait for it to center. Just be patient with it. Being aggressive will get you nowhere. So we're a little fast now, so let's throw out some drag and slow down to make our speed more manageable. Drop the gear and reduce thrust to decelerate to approach speed, which is 157 knots for our forecasted landing weight. Even though we are controlling thrust manually, we will set our target speed on the FCP. This gives us the bug on the speed tape, which makes it a little clearer. We've also just dropped flaps to 35 as well, which puts us in the landing configuration, so all we need to worry about now is flying the aircraft. The added drag is assisting in our deceleration to approach speed, and we're going through some chop that I'd like to put down to uplift over the hills, but unfortunately it's more likely just another flight simulator weather glitch. If this happens to you, just keep things steady through it and don't try to compensate. I just turned out the VOR and ADF pointers on the ND. We could have done this a lot earlier, but we were a bit preoccupied with the hand flying workload. This declutters the display a bit by getting rid of unneeded information and allows us to focus our attention solely on the localizer CDI. If you look carefully at the cute little airplane symbol in the center of the navigation display, you'll see that it's offset at a bit of an angle to what is now a perfectly centered CDI. This is due to the wind, and the aircraft is pointing to the actual heading. We are making a slight correction to our sync rate as well, but the speed is still on. And spending minimum time away from our flying duties, let's briefly go through the before landing checklist, the physical items for which we completed earlier. So gear down should already be 4 green, we can see that. Spoilers armed, auto brakes medium, flaps 35, altimeters checked 1011 set, EAD nothing of concern. Before landing checklist complete. We completed that checklist just in time to a pass through 1500 feet radar altitude, so the green config box has appeared on the EAD and all is set for landing. All we need to do now is fly her on down. We're aligned perfectly on localizer and glide slope, but both get more and more sensitive the closer we get to the actual transmitters. It is now more important than ever to keep corrections very gentle. You can see here that we're correcting just a little to the right to center the CDI, and it requires very little intervention from the pilot to make a big difference there. So the correction for now looks just fine, but with just a little jerk to the right, you can see that that was way too much, and notice how the smallest of changes has put it right through the localizer. And to be honest, we're nitpicking a bit here since it only equates to a few feet in reality when we're this close in. So don't chase the localizer now, and focus on the lead-in lights for lateral guidance. Glide slope wise though, it's important to be as accurate as you can, so keep an eye on the lead lights and the runway, and start your turn onto final. Given the wind today, we'll need to make this one tight to prevent ourselves being blown through the center line. So add power in the turn as necessary and apply as much back pressure as you need to control your sink. It's very important. It's likely to be a lot. We are a little low here, so watch that sink rate. 4 reds, 1 white is not a nice sight. So watch vertical speed and align it with that center line. Don't forget that 18 knot crosswind component. Keep her pointed into the wind and kick out the crab in the flare. Just settling in and thump. A little rough, but bang in the touchdown zone, so don't delay with the reverse thrust. This isn't the longest of runways, and you'll continue to slow down here with reverse thrust, and also verifying that the brakes are engaged. That said, we're slowing well, so stow the thrust reversers at 80 knots and take out the auto brakes to keep her rolling at the high speed turn off. Don't be discouraged by the RO glide slope warnings we had there. We were a little low, yes, but we compensated well and put her down right on the markers. A 21 knot crosswind doesn't help things either, so that is the intense and difficult Kai-Tak approach. And you've seen aircraft land on this runway on YouTube. Obviously this airport is closed now, but this, if you were able to do it, is one challenging and awesome approach. So you've come a long way. We are done with the non-precision approaches, and we will now be moving on to the precision approaches. If you were able to complete all of the approaches and procedures up until this point, you are a top-notch virtual aviator, and it's only going to get better from here as you continue to perfect your skills. So that is it for this session of the PMDG MD11 training. Until next time, throttle on.